We'll go ahead and be turning to the 27th chapter of the book of Acts. Acts chapter 27. We're going to be resuming our study that we left off in a week and a half ago in Acts chapter 27. A couple things to note before we get into Acts 27. Again, if you haven't already, we're coming quickly to the end of Acts. If you haven't, we'll pick up the Romans material on the front. There'll be outlines and questions for each of the 16 chapters, as well as an introduction lesson. There's no questions with it, but just giving some background material to the book of Romans today, an outline that we're going to follow in it, as we have in Luke and Acts. We'll have an outline breakdown in there. Those things will be in that introduction lesson. If you are like me and you prefer an electronic copy because you don't have to worry about keeping up with it, in a PDF copy, just let me know. I can get you one. I keep mine in a PDF copy and then split screen on my iPad, or I put it in my Bible program. So if you want a PDF copy, if you use a tablet or some kind of one, let me know and I can get that to you as well. But we're quickly coming to the end of the book of Acts. We're in chapter 27. We're halfway through it. We started it a week and a half ago before I was out of town, and so we're going to try to finish up chapter 27 here this evening, and then get into chapter 28 probably Sunday. I would say odds are next Wednesday at the latest is probably when we'll finish the book of Acts, if we don't finish it up Sunday morning. So if you want to go ahead and pick up that Romans material, if you want to go ahead and get ready for study of the book of Romans. Now, back to Acts chapter 26. We're going to set the background up and remind ourselves of where we are in the book of Acts. It's been, again, a week and a half since we were in the book of Acts. The book divides itself down into two major sections that we've been following. The Gospel of Palestine in 1 to 12, and the Gospel in the uttermost parts of the world in 13 to the end of the book. Again, we've been in that last section for some time. That encompasses Paul's 3 preaching journeys, as well as the journey to Rome, his imprisonment and journey to Rome, where we are in chapter 27 in the story as Paul's being sent to Rome. Quickly to remind ourselves of how we got where we are in chapter 27. Going back to chapter 21, Paul in chapter 21 came to Jerusalem. And when he came to Jerusalem, there were some of the Jews who had heard that Paul said you cannot keep the customs of the law of Moses. Not that it wasn't necessary. They agreed it was not necessary, and they would not bind that on the Gentiles. But they were under the impression that Paul was saying they couldn't keep it. You want to circumcise your children? They were under the impression Paul said no. You want to observe this, do this or that from the old law. You can't do that. That's what they were believing. Not that they were trying to bind it, but that Paul said you could not observe it, period. That wasn't true. Paul observed some of the customs himself. That's why he's even coming to Jerusalem before for a feast. Earlier in the book, he was trying to make it a feast. And so, Paul's trying to show to them that he believes you can keep the customs of the law of Moses. And so it was recommended by the elders and by James there in Acts chapter 21 that he go to the temple with these men who were taking the vow, and pay for them in the taking of this vow, and purify himself with them. When they came back near the end of those days when the purification was complete, there were some Jews from Asia who made accusations against Paul. They teaches against this place, the temple, against this people, the Jews, and against Moses, that is the law, and that he brought a Gentile into the temple. That last one they supposed. The other 3 was a misunderstanding of what Paul had been saying, as he in fact points out that God has fulfilled the law. So he wasn't speaking against it. We'll come to that later on in the book of Acts, in our review, where we already came across that in some later chapters. So the first one was they had supposed, because they saw him as a Gentile. The other 3 was a misunderstanding of his teaching. It caused an uproar. They're going to drag Paul away. But then the tribune comes and saves him, is trying to take him to the barracks, but Paul has to address the people. That's where 22 takes place. Paul addresses the Jews. They hang intently on every word he says until he says what word? Gentile. And now, he's not fit to live. They were willing to listen to him, but when he said he had to go preach to the Gentiles, now this man He's not fit to live. That's their opinion in chapter 23. Tribute takes him to the barracks. His solution from saving him from getting killed is flogging for answers. And then Paul points out, is it lawful to flog a Roman citizen unto death? The answer is, no, it was against the law of the Romans. And so he didn't flog him. So the decision is, we can't flog him. The Jews are no help. Some are shouting one thing, some are shouting another. The solution, let's send him to the Sanhedrin. Chapter 23 comes to the Sanhedrin Council. That's when Paul can already tell he's not getting a fair trial. They've passed judgment on him. Because when he says, I've lived in all good conscience before God and to this day, the high priest orders he's struck on the mouth. Paul hasn't said anything about where he stands on anything. Just simply he lives in all good conscience. They've already passed judgment on Paul, which is contrary to the law of Moses. The very law they say, they're judging him by. And so Paul rebukes the high priest that he says you shouldn't have, according to the law, you shouldn't speak against the rulers. But he goes on to then say to them that it's with hope of the resurrection of the day that he stands there. The reason he says that, he understands, first of all, there's not a fair trial. They've already passed judgment contrary to the law. But there's Pharisees and Sadducees that make up the Sanhedrin. Pharisees believe in the resurrection, in angels, and in spirits. The Sadducees do not. It causes a division between them. The Pharisees and Sadducees are at each other's throat. The Sadducees are saying, much like the other Jews, were probably saying he's not fit to live. The Pharisees said, we don't find any fault in him. In fact, they said, what if a spirit or an angel said to him? It seems to me they're kind of trying to stir the Sadducees a little bit more by their reaction, to the point that it becomes violent between the two groups, and the Scripture has to take Paul out. The end of chapter 23, the Jews are requesting to be brought back before the Sanhedrin. Not because they want to hear further, but because there is more than 40 who have taken a vow that they're going to not eat until they kill him. So they're going to bring him, and Paul's nephew finds out, tells Paul, who sends him to the centurion to tell the tribune. They come up with a plan to send him to Caesarea. That's where 24 takes place. He stands before a governor by the name of Felix in chapter 24. In chapter 24, it's time before Felix. And the Jews come and they hire an orator to come, or a spokesman to come, somebody who makes their living with speaking, to try to make the argument for them. He's a good speaker. Let him butter up Felix. Let him say all these good things about Felix and so on and so forth, and maybe, just maybe, we don't have to give much evidence, because the fact is, they have no evidence. Well, when it's concluded, Felix is not impressed with their argumentation there. It doesn't matter how good a spokesman he was, he had no evidence against Paul, and so Paul refutes them by saying, listen, there's no evidence, it's been 12 days, they have brought nothing before you. And Felix knew that Paul was innocent. But he leaves him there and says, I'll wait for the tribune to come. He hears from Paul often. And Paul reasons with him about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. Felix was alarmed and trembled. He understood the condition he was in, yet he delayed. Not just delayed in obeying the gospel, he delayed in making a decision on Paul. Well, some time had passed. A man by the name of Porcius Festus came to be governor into chapter 24 and into the beginning of chapter 25. And now that Felix is out of office and Festus is there, it is Festus' responsibility to deal with Paul. He goes to Jerusalem. The Jews say, bring Paul here so we can hear him. He says, listen, I'm going to Caesarea. You come testify. They come testify. 2 years later, still have no evidence. You know why they don't have evidence? Paul did nothing wrong. They come in and make their case, and that's when Festus asks if Paul will go stand before him in Jerusalem, trying to do the Jews a favor. Paul says, no, I've done nothing wrong, contrary to their law, or contrary to your law, and the law of the Romans, and so I appeal to Caesar as a Roman citizen. That's Paul's right. He decides to appeal to Caesar. King Agrippa comes there, and in discussion with Agrippa, Festus basically says, listen, there's a man Felix left here, and the Jews want him dead, and the argument wasn't even over anything I would have thought. It's about a man named Jesus. The Jews say he's dead, and Paul says he's alive. There's a dispute that's causing this problem between them. Agrippa hears him, concludes he's done nothing deserving of death, Not only deserving of death, but not even of prison. But he's appealed to Caesar, so to Caesar he must go. So Agrippa, like Felix there, was almost persuaded. He understood what he needed to do. He didn't respond. That brings us then into chapter 27. To Caesar, he's appealed to Caesar he must go. Chapter 27, you can remember it this way. To Caesar he went. Right? He's going on his way to Caesar. Now, except he doesn't quite get there in chapter 27, not until chapter 28. But they set out here from Caesarea and sailed along through near Cyprus and on down to Crete, where they decide they're going to sail on in spite of the winter time. So we'll remind ourselves of some of these things in the early verses real quick. And then we're down to verse 27 where we'll pick up in a moment. We'll look at a couple of phrases previous to that we didn't spend much time on before. Section 1 through 12, Fairhaven, from Caesarea to Fairhaven. So the way of travel is given here by Luke, who is traveling with Paul. As it notes in the travel, when he's talking about the travel. So Luke is here with Paul on this journey. The way of travel is from Caesarea to Sidon, and then they sailed over Cyprus. So if you go back and look at the map, you'll notice Cyprus is right over here, and they sailed over Cyprus. They come through here, and then they go under Crete. It has to do with the winds and the direction the winds are coming, and what was the safest way to travel this time of year based on those winds is why they go over and under so on. So they sail over Cyprus, then they travel to Cnidus, and they go under Crete, because that's the better way to go again because of the winds and everything that takes place, and come to a place called Fairhavens. It's there at Fairhavens that they are going to be put on a ship and are going to set sail not all the way, just a little bit farther down Crete. So they're not going all the way to Rome right now. They know that's not safe. Their plan is we're going to go a little farther on Crete. The reason they take the boat is because this, instead of going, is this isn't a prison transport. And like today, if we're transporting a prisoner in our country, we don't just take, this is something shipping cargo. You wouldn't see them take a prisoner and put them on the back of the UPS truck and send them across the nation. We have on guards, but that's not how this was done here. They got on the boat that they could get on. And so this is a boat sailing to Rome. They're going to get on it. The captain and the owner of the boat decide we're going to go on. And so it's decided by the centurion there that's guarding the prisoner, Paul and the prisoners there on the boat. They're going to go with them. That's why they don't go by foot. Because if you're on Crete, it would take a long time, but you could go from one side of the island to the other by foot. They get on the boat with them and decide to go a little farther. Well, they don't get to make it very far. They decide to sail along the coast instead of sailing out into the open sea. And then, as they go to sail, we know later on the storm comes up. But before they left, as they're making their plans to leave, Paul warns them, listen, this is not a good idea. This time of year, with these winds and all the things that are taking place, with the winter coming, it is a bad idea to try to set sail. If we do, there'll be a loss of cargo, a loss of ship, and a loss of lives, because it's very dangerous. Again, we pointed out a couple of weeks ago when we were studying here previously, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul says 3 times I was shipwrecked. That's before this one. This is at least number 4. 2 Corinthians is written during Paul's preaching journeys. He's been in prison for 2 years already at this point. Paul been on the sea quite a bit, been in some shipwrecks. That's the way he would travel often as you go back through his preaching journeys. When they were going through areas you couldn't walk, you couldn't get on a plane like we did today, so they would sail. Paul understood that and said, listen, it's not a good idea. But the centurion doesn't listen to Paul. He listens to the owner of the boat and to the captain of the boat, and they set sail. Well, now we go from Fairhavens to Malta. If you're reading along what the plans are, that's not what the plans were. The plans were never to come near Malta, but that's where we end up. They began to set sail in 13 through 38. In 13 through 12, a strong man in darkness scared all of those on board to the point that they were afraid that and had given up all hope of being saved. If you look back in the text, in verse 20, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. So, you can imagine being on the ship. You've not seen the sun or stars for many, many days at this point. And at this point, they're thinking, there's no way we're making it safely. The plan, again, was to stay near the shore. They had to miss an island. But let me just back up here real quick to the map to give us an idea. So, here's where we are. We're right here near Lacey. That's where Fair Havens is. The plan is to sail over to this side of Crete, to stay along the shore. As you read along, they had to, going back to back in the text, into verse number 16, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda or Claudia, depending on the translation. They were afraid they were going to run aground on this. Now, that's where this island is. May not look like much on this map, but this scale down here is about 300 miles, so this is probably about 50 miles off of Crete or so. To give you an idea how far off course they are at this point. They're a good ways off course. It's not like we're saying they're just slightly off. They're a good ways off course because of the storm coming. And so they were afraid they were going to run aground there. They're not seeing any land. They're now just out in the open water. And all hope has been abandoned by those on the ship that they're going to be, at least maybe with the exception of Paul. We know Paul doesn't lose hope here. But the others here have lost all hope and abandoned all hope of being saved. It's then that verse 21 occurs. Now it says, since we've been without food a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. First thing Paul says was, I told you, this was going to happen if we left Crete. Then he says in verse 22, yet now I urge you, take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. Now, if you're listening to Paul at this point, and you don't know anything about this man, I don't know how much these other prisoners knew about Paul at this point that are on the ship, or even how much they may have known. If some man stands up and you've not seen the sun in many days, you've not seen the stars in many days, you're in the middle of the open water, it is pitch black outside, the boat is being tossed back and forth, you're afraid to eat at this point because you're afraid you're going to run out of the food while you're being tossed about. And you think there's no way we're going to be saved, and he says, take heart, nobody's going to die. Your first thought's probably going to be, he's crazy. But then he goes on to say, for this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve. Something to note about this, as we noted previously when we were in this, looking at this section briefly a few weeks ago, is that in spite of the fact that Paul had already been told he's going to make it to Rome, God finds it necessary to send an angel here to remind him, you're going to make it to Rome. And there are times today we may be in the face of adversity and we may forget about some principle that is laid out in God's Word. For example, the Lord has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. Yet perhaps at times we face difficulties and we may feel like we're forsaken. And we need to read and be reminded of those things. And this tells us the importance of being reminded if things we may already know, even in the face of difficult situations. God sends an angel to remind Paul here that, Paul, you will indeed stand before Caesar in Rome. So Paul's reminded them in these verses, verse number 23. Then in verse 24, Paul says, do not be afraid. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. Again, there's that reaffirming of what Paul had already been told previously. You must stand before Caesar. And he said, behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So not only are you going to stand before Caesar, but everybody else on this boat with you. is going to make it. Paul says to him in verse 25, "So take heart, men, for I have faith in God." I like the New King James Version. "For I believe God." There is a difference in one believing in God and one believing God. There are many there are some who may be on this boat who believe in the God of the Bible, who believe in the things that, who believe in some of the things they've heard and read and believe that God exists, but yet they may not believe His Word. We see that today. There are those who say, "I believe in God," but then reject His Word and say, "I don't think that's true." Some of you may sit on a passage and they say, "I think that's outdated," or "I don't think that's true," or "I don't think God meant it that way." They believe in God. They do not believe God. Some say, "Well, I believe God exists, but I don't believe that He will punish those who are wicked." They believe in God. Not a true, genuine faith and obedience, but they believe in God and that God exists. But they do not believe God and believe what He said, and that His Word will be, that what He has said will come to pass.
But in this instance, it would have only been human for Him to have had qualms about what He'd been doing, because the storm was so ravaging and so bad. Everybody else had given up hope. And this angel was sent. He didn't call me to remind me. So we shouldn't begrudge ourselves a little reminding once in a while when somebody else's prayers lift up the wind beneath our wings because we get discouraged or frustrated or weak. But it would have only been human for Him to have flagged a little bit here with the food running out and the storm being so bad and everybody else flailing and going on, and we were talking about the food. Think how bad the seasickness would have been. Ooh, that would have been horrible. And they were all in those close spaces. That would have just been, so it would have been natural, human, for Him to have doubted.
You're right, and that shows even more here Paul's faith in God in his reaction to the message. Take another example. When you go back into, when we studied the book of Luke, and an angel comes to Zacharias and tells him, "You and your wife are going to have a baby." His reaction is, "But we're well advanced in years." His reaction is, "That's not possible." And that's why he doesn't speak again until John is born. So here he is, even though he's somebody that has faith in God, who in that moment, in a moment of weakness, doubts that what God said will be true. But Paul here has that opposite reaction. An angel comes to him and says, "You're going to stand before Caesar." Despite of all the evidence to the contrary, he says, "I believe God, that it will be exactly as I have been told," in verse 25. Now, he does tell them, we must run aground on some island. The ship is going to crash, but as long as we stay on it, he's going to point that later on when some of them are trying to flee, they need to stay on this boat. As long as we stay here, and we're going to stay on this boat until it runs aground, God is going to save us. His reason is because if God said it, that is good enough for me. Question number 10 in our book. Think of some practical applications of Paul's statement. I believe God. Listen to some circumstances in life where in human wisdom will point in a different direction than the Word of God. So, what he's asking here is, kind of what we were saying, human wisdom says in this situation, we're going to die. Paul says, God says we're going to be saved. I believe we're going to be saved. So what are some practical applications for us where perhaps human wisdom says, here's what I think. but we need to believe God. What are some examples?
When people said it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt what I'm saying. It doesn't hurt anybody if we cheat on our taxes. Because the Bible tells us we are to do due diligence and we are supposed to obey the law and we need to listen to God. How about teenagers? When everybody else is saying, all the peer pressure is saying, go to the dance, go to the dance. Nah, that's all foggy stuff. No. We need to listen to God. When He said it's lasciviousness and it's wrong and there's all kinds of things wrong with it, we need to listen to the Bible.
You're right. When it comes to those kinds of things, human wisdom pulls us in this one direction, but we need to understand what God says. Yes.
I think about Abraham. He's already promised that not Ishmael, but Isaac was going to be the father of many. His descendants will be innumerable. But yet, God says, take him and sacrifice him. So, human logic would say, I'm misunderstanding God or something like that. There's no way, because if I kill him, that he can't. Of course, the Hebrew writer says that Abraham had, faith in God would raise him. But then you think about Daniel, who's told not to pray. What he did, he went ahead and prayed. That was his custom. Okay, he went in to the lion's den, and God delivered him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Hebrews 11 is full of things that people, I should say, and historical accounts of people by faith doing God's will when the flesh or the human wisdom would say, there's no way I can be obedient to this command because if I do, then this can't come about. Well, nothing is too hard for God.
Right, you're right. And I think Abraham is a great example of the same attitude that Paul possessed in I believe God. To the point when Abraham here is saying that if this was stated, God will raise him from the dead. Go back through and find. Do we have a recorded case yet of anybody being raised from the dead prior to that? No. But Abraham knows that attitude of God, all things are possible. In fact, one of the things that easy with that was he had a kid when he was 99 years old. It was when he was told he would have a son, he was born when he was 9.
Very similar to Elizabeth and Zachariah there.
Yes.
Very similar circumstances.
Right. You're right. Very similar to those circumstances here. Here's a couple more things. A couple of examples here of some practical ways. How to discipline a child. You think about all the so-called experts in today's field, and you don't need to use the rod. This is what you need to do now. Nowadays, it's more about positive reinforcement. Listen, there's nothing wrong with telling a kid good job. Sometimes a kid needs a spanking. Just telling them good job when they do good doesn't deter them from the bad. It's not just drawing them towards the good. A kid has folly in their heart. Proverbs will point that out. And the way to drive that out is with the rod. You don't need to just try to bring them towards the good. Sometimes it takes you to drive away from the bad to bring them to what is good. What about withdrawing from the disorderly? We talked about several weeks back some attitudes that are possessed that kill a church. One we talked about was the I think attitude. Sometimes people say, I think the best way to handle this situation. And in that example, we're talking about church discipline. Sometimes that's in a lot of ways we use the I think attitude. But particularly in discipline, I think for my friends, my family, for this situation, this is what's best. Yet God says, here's how it's to be done.
And like King Saul thought it would be better to leave those animals alive and sacrifice them. That was disobedience. And then God's Spirit left him.
You're right. That's an example there where he used his wisdom, what he supposed, versus what God said. God controls the nations. Daniel 4:25, the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men. We have to remind ourselves of that, and sometimes human wisdom pulls us in the direction. The power of the gospel. Maybe we're teaching and we don't think the people are obeying. We have to remember the power of the gospel. It is the power of God's salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. What about the fact that there will always be a remnant? Sometimes we look around and we're like Elijah and we say, I alone am left. And Daniel 2:44 says, and in those days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. The kingdom will never be destroyed. Not only will Christ continue to rule, but there will always be a remnant of those who are in the kingdom. The power of prayer. Perhaps we pray and we don't think that our prayers are being answered. We have to remember that the effective prayer of a righteous man has great power as it is working. James 5:16. Or that God will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we can bear. 1 Corinthians 10:12 through 13. So those are a few examples of some things where sometimes human wisdom says, I can't, in sin, I can't help myself. God says we're not going to be tempted beyond what we can bear. We can help ourselves. There always has been and always will be a way of escape. The question is, are we going to take it? So those are some examples of some things where human wisdom may pull us in one direction, but we've got to believe. We've got to believe God. Let's go through here. We got a few minutes left. The latter half of this text unfolds a little bit quicker here, so we'll read starting in verse 27 now. We'll read through the end of the text and hit some of these highlights here in 27, or in chapter 27. Now, on the 14th night it comes, we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea. About midnight, the sailors suspected that they were drawing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And hearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for a day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the boat, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day, and you've continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength. For not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wind into the sea. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach, but striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The boat struck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land. And the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship, and so it was that all were brought safely to land. So, 27 to 38, they sail closer to land, and as they get close, they decide we're going to put the anchors down as we get closer to land. Sort of slow them down a little bit as they get closer. They know they're getting close. They were checking the here near the land. As they came, they were sounding and found 20 fathoms. That's about 120 feet. The fathom was about 6 feet or 2 meters. Then they found 15 a little bit later. That's about 90 feet. So they're getting a little bit closer. Things aren't quite like they were. It's not quite as deep as it was before. They're getting closer, so they let down the anchors to slow down. Well, then some of the men on the boat decide we're going to try to escape. Paul tells them, no, God's going to spare us, but we all have to stay on the ship. And so the soldiers cut away the ropes so the sailors cannot escape. Then Paul takes food, he blesses it. Here's a quick lesson for us to learn. Even in the face of this difficult situation, Paul took time to give thanks to God. So there's a lesson for us to learn in that. And they ate the food. Well, then they're shipwrecked and they're all saved. The ship runs aground, breaks into pieces, but everybody's saved. The soldiers were going to kill the prisoners first. They didn't want them to escape. But the centurion, who's been with Paul since he was put on the first ship, has come to like Paul and doesn't want anything to happen to him. And so he says, no, let's not do that. Instead, they have those that can swim jump overboard and swim. You're close to the land. You can see the land. Swim there. If you can't swim, as the ship falls apart, grab onto the debris that's floating and just sort of kick your way in and get into the land. And so that's what they do. And there's about 200, there's in all 276 persons, according to verse 37, and all of them make it safely to land, just as God had said. So Paul said, I believe God. And now there are those that are present. We know Luke is there, so there's 200, there's at least 2 that are Christians. But that means that there could be up to 274 others that aren't. And now see, Paul said, that the God that Paul worshipped said we would be saved, and indeed we were. And so there's a lesson for them in that, especially as Paul does some teaching later on on some of the things they probably heard while on the boat from Paul. But God preserves them just as He said He would.
It's easy to think all they would have is like small crude boats, but if they're letting down anchors and they're accommodating that many people, and then the food that it would have taken, all that kind of stuff, plus they had cargo aboard, they must have some pretty big vessels back in.
Yes, this would have been a rather large ship with all the cargo and the prisoners, you're right. And not only would it have been a rather large ship, I think it tells us something about the intensity of the storm. If you're in a small boat, it's not going to take very much waves to start tossing you about. But you're in a big boat, it's going to take some pretty big waves to toss it about. I think it tells us something too about how intense the storm was, the storm that caused them to fear for their lives. But yet again, as they come to the end, that big ship is lost, but underlying Sunday morning we'll pick up in chapter 28. Again, we'll pick up the Romans material. We've got just one chapter left in the book of Acts. We'll finish up probably Sunday or next Wednesday, so we'll go ahead and pick up the Romans material and prepare for that.